When Edward walked into his father's study that afternoon, he found him crying. But these weren't tears of sadness. In his hand was a letter, and on his face, something Edward hadn't seen in 8 months, a smile, crooked, imperfect, but a smile nonetheless. Edward stood frozen in the doorway. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. His father. The man who hadn't left that room in months. The man who refused to look in the mirror. The man who'd stopped speaking because his voice sounded slurred and strange. That man was smiling. And beside him, seated in a chair near the bed, was Maria, the housekeeper Edward had hired 4 months ago, just to clean the house, just to clean. But what Maria was doing had nothing to do with cleaning. She was listening, her eyes filled with tears, as Professor Robert, or Bob, as people called him, read a letter aloud. His voice still sounded odd, slurred. The words came out crooked, just like his smile. But they were coming out. For the first time in 8 months, the words were flowing. If this story is touching your heart, stick around until the end, because what you're about to discover about Maria will change the way you see people who work in silence. Before I tell you what happened next, you need to understand who Professor Bob Salazar was before his face betrayed him. Professor Robert Bob Salazar was 58 years old. He'd been an English professor for 30 years. 30 years standing in front of a classroom, reciting poetry, telling stories, igniting a love for words in generations of students. He was the kind of professor students never forget. The one who made you cry with a poem. The one who made you laugh with a story. The one who made you think with a question that had no easy answer every morning. Professor Bob woke up at 5 a.m. He showered, shaved carefully, and put on his best shirt, because for him, every class was a performance, every lesson was a show, and every student was an audience that deserved his absolute best. He arrived at the university an hour before his first class. He sat in his office, surrounded by books, and reread the passages he was going to teach that day. He practiced them aloud, searching for the perfect intonation, the exact rhythm, the dramatic pause at just the right moment. His colleagues thought he was eccentric. Who prepares this much to give a literature class? But Professor Bob knew something they didn't understand. Words have power, but only if you say them right, only if you feel them, only if you live them, and he lived them. When he recited Shakespeare, the students could feel the love trembling in the air. When he read Edgar Allan Poe, the classroom became a haunted house, a space of ghosts and inner turmoil. When he discussed Maya Angelou, it was as if she herself was in the room, defending the right to be heard. His voice was his instrument, his face was his stage. Every expression and every gesture, every movement of his lips was part of the magic. And then, 8 months ago, everything changed. It started with a headache. Nothing serious, he thought. He took a pill and went on with his life. But the next day, when he woke up, something was wrong. He couldn't close his left eye. His mouth was twisted to one side. When he tried to speak, the words came out slurred, incomprehensible. Bell's palsy. That's what the doctors said. It's temporary, they promised. In a few weeks, a few months at most, your face will return to normal. You just need to do facial exercises and be patient. But the weeks passed, and the months passed, and Professor Bob's face didn't return to normal. Half of his face remained paralyzed. His left eye wouldn't close completely. So he had to wear an eye patch to sleep. His mouth stayed twisted, which made him drool uncontrollably. And his voice, that voice that had captivated thousands of students, now sounded like a drunkard's. The doctors said he needed to do facial exercises every day, move the muscles, stimulate the nerves. Little by little, the function would return. But Professor Bob refused. Not because he was stubborn, not because he didn't want to get better. He refused because it was humiliating. Sitting in front of a mirror and making faces like a clown, trying to smile when only half of his face responded, practicing words that came out twisted and meaningless, for a man who had lived by his voice and his expression. Those exercises were torture, so he stopped doing them, and he also stopped doing everything else. He stopped leaving his room. He stopped seeing his friends. He stopped talking to his family. He stopped looking in the mirror. And above all, he stopped teaching. The university tried to convince him to stay. They offered him paid medical leave. They offered him accommodations. They offered him online classes, without a camera, just audio. Professor Bob rejected it all. "You don't understand," he said in his last call. "I'm not just a voice that explains literature. I'm a face that lives it. I'm gestures, expressions, looks, and without that, I'm nothing." His colleagues cried when they heard the news. His former students organized a social media campaign asking him to return. Hundreds of messages arrived. "Professor, we miss you. Professor, you changed our lives. Professor, don't abandon us." But Professor Bob didn't read any of them. He had stopped using the phone. He had stopped checking his email. He had stopped existing for the outside world. He locked himself in his room and decided that if he couldn't be the professor he had been, then he wouldn't be anything. Edward, his only son, was desperate. Edward was 35 years old. He was a tech entrepreneur. He had money, power, connections. But none of that could heal his father. He hired the best neurologists. He hired specialized physical therapists. He hired psychologists who tried to convince Professor Bob that his life wasn't over. Nothing worked. The neurologists said the prognosis was good, but only if Professor Bob did the exercises. The physical therapists were frustrated because the patient refused to cooperate. The psychologists said he was suffering from severe depression and needed medication, but Professor Bob rejected it all. "I don't want pills," he said. "I don't want exercises. I don't want you to look at me with pity. I just want you to leave me alone." And Edward, not knowing what else to do, left him alone. He hired nurses to make sure he ate and took his basic medications. He hired cleaning staff to maintain the house. And he visited his father once a week, although the visits always ended in uncomfortable silence. 4 months ago, one of the housekeepers quit. She said she couldn't work in such a sad house, and Edward had to find a replacement. That's how Maria came into the picture. If you don't believe in coincidences, just keep listening, because what happened next? It can't be just random chance. Maria Torres was 44 years old. She'd worked as a housekeeper since she was 18. She didn't have a college degree, no certifications, nothing on paper that made her seem particularly special. But Maria had something you can't learn in any school. She had a heart that understood the pain of losing your sense of self, your identity, because her own sister had gone through the same thing when Maria was 24. Her older sister, Sarah, was 30. Sarah was beautiful. She had a boyfriend who adored her. They were planning to get married in the spring. And then one morning, Sarah woke up with half her face paralyzed, Bell's palsy. The same ailment that Professor Robert Bob Salazar now had. The doctors said the same thing they told Bob. "It's temporary, with exercises you'll recover, be patient." But Sarah's boyfriend, he wasn't patient. He saw her with her crooked smile, drooling, speaking with slurred speech, and something in him. It changed. He started visiting her less, started making excuses, and 3 months later, he dumped her. "I can't," he told her. "I can't marry someone who looks like that. I'm sorry." Sarah begged him. She pleaded. She promised she'd get better, that the doctors said the paralysis was temporary, that she just needed patience. But he wouldn't listen. "I'm in love with the woman you were," he said, "not the one you are now." And he left. Maria was there when it happened. She was 24 years old and couldn't understand how a man could say something so cruel. She couldn't understand how love could disappear because of something as superficial as a crooked face. But what marked her the most was what happened afterwards. Sarah stopped leaving the house because she stopped seeing her friends. She stopped looking for work. She spent her days locked in her room, staring at old photos of when she was beautiful. The paralysis improved over time. 80%, the doctors said. You barely noticed it if you didn't look closely. But the damage, it was already done. It wasn't her face that had been paralyzed. It was her soul. Sarah never recovered, not from the paralysis, which eventually improved by 80%. She recovered from the rejection, from the abandonment, from feeling like a monster. She was 30 years old when it happened. Now she was 50, and she'd never married, never had another relationship. She lived alone, worked alone, dying alone a little more each day. Maria had seen what rejection and shame could do to a person. She'd seen how her sister, a brilliant and beautiful woman, had turned into a shadow of her former self, and she'd vowed that she would never let anyone suffer alone for something they didn't choose. On her first day of work, Maria arrived at 7 a.m. The house was silent. The nurses explained the situation to her. Professor Robert Bob Salazar doesn't leave his room. He doesn't want to see anyone. Just leave his meals at the door and don't bother him. Maria nodded and started cleaning. But as she cleaned, she observed. She observed the photos on the wall. A man standing in front of a classroom, his arms open as if he were reciting something. Students sitting, looking at him with fascination. She observed the books on the shelves, poetry, novels, literary essays, a collection that had taken decades to build. She observed the framed diplomas, Professor of the Year, 3 times, recognition for academic excellence, honorary mentions from universities. This man had been someone important, someone who had dedicated his life to words, to stories, to igniting the imagination of others. And now he was locked in a room, in silence, letting himself die of shame. And then Maria observed something else. In a corner of the living room, there was an old box. It was covered in dust, as if no one had touched it in years. Maria approached it. She opened it carefully. Inside were letters, hundreds of letters, handwritten, on paper yellowed with age. She picked one up and opened it. My dearest Robert, it read, it's been 2 weeks since you left for college, and I don't know how to live without you anymore. I'm counting the days until you come back. Yours always, and Eleanor. They were love letters. Letters between Professor Robert Bob Salazar and his wife, Elena, Edward's mother. Elena had died 15 years ago. Cancer. But before that, before getting married, they had a 5-year long-distance courtship. She was in Guadalajara. He was in Mexico City. And during those 5 years, they had written letters almost every day. Maria picked up another letter at random. This one was from Professor Robert Bob Salazar to Elena. My dearest Elena, it read. Today I gave a lecture on Neruda, and all I could think about was you. The poet speaks of love as if he invented it, but I know that the true inventor was you. Every word I read reminds me of your voice. Every verse reminds me of your laughter. Tell me about your day. Tell me everything. Because your words are the air I breathe, yours always, and Robert. Maria read another, and another, and another. Each letter was a work of art, poetry in prose, love distilled into words. There were happy letters, sad letters, letters full of plans for the future. There were letters written on sunny days, and letters written on rainy nights, and in all of them, without exception, there was love, a love so profound that, 15 years after Eleanor's death, the letters were still vibrating with life. Maria understood something in that moment. Professor Robert Bob Salazar wasn't just a professor. He was a poet, a writer, a man who had lived and breathed words his entire life, and now, locked in his room, he had stopped writing, he had stopped reading, he had stopped talking, he had stopped existing. Maria closed the box of letters, but she didn't forget what she had discovered. That night, at home, she couldn't sleep. She thought about Professor Robert Bob Salazar. She thought about her sister Sarah. She thought about how shame could destroy a person from the inside. And then, she had an idea. It was a crazy idea. An idea that probably wouldn't work, but it was an idea. Professor Robert Bob Salazar wasn't doing the facial exercises because they were humiliating, because they had no meaning, because they were mechanical, cold, soulless. But reading letters, writing letters, that was different. That was what he'd done his whole life. That was who he was. And every time you read a letter out loud, you move your lips, you exercise the muscles in your face, you stimulate the nerves. It was exactly what the doctors wanted, but disguised as something that Professor Robert Bob Salazar loved. Maria didn't know if it would work. She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't a therapist. She was just a housekeeper with a hunch. But she had to try, and she understood something deep. Professor Robert Bob Salazar wasn't just a literature professor. He was a man of letters, a man who had lived for words, through words, by words, and now, locked away in his room. He had no words, only silence. Maria tucked the letters away in the box, but she didn't forget about them, because something inside her had begun to take shape, an idea. Crazy, perhaps, but an idea. If this video is making you think, share it. Sometimes the algorithm hides the things we most need to see. The second week on the job, Maria did something that wasn't in her job description. She wrote a letter. It wasn't a professional letter. It wasn't a formal letter. It was a personal letter, handwritten, like the ones she wrote to her mother every week for the past 20 years. "Dear Professor Robert," she began, "you don't know me. I'm the new housekeeper who cleans your house. But I wanted to tell you something. My sister had Bell's palsy when she was 30 years old. Her boyfriend left her because he couldn't stand how she looked. She never recovered, not from the palsy, from the shame. I watched her wither away, and I did nothing. I was young and didn't know how to help her, but I'm not young anymore, and I don't want to stand by and do nothing. I don't know if you'll read this. I don't know if you care what a housekeeper has to say, but I wanted you to know that you're not alone, that someone in this house understands what it's like to lose the face the world knew. With respect, Maria." She folded the letter, put it in an envelope, and slipped it under Professor Bob's door. Then she went back to cleaning. She didn't expect a response. She didn't expect anything. She just wanted him to know that someone saw him, that someone understood. A day passed, 2 days, a week. Nothing. Maria kept cleaning, kept observing, kept waiting. And then, 8 days later, she found something under her apron in the closet where she kept her things. A folded piece of paper. She opened it. There was only one line, written in shaky handwriting, almost illegible. "Who are you?" Maria smiled. It was Professor Robert's first communication with anyone in months, and he had chosen to communicate through a letter. That night, Maria wrote another letter. She told him her story. She told him about her sister. She told him about the letters she wrote to her mother every week, without fail, for the past 20 years. She told him about what words meant to her, and she asked him a question. "You were an English professor. They weren't you? I found your books, your diplomas, your love letters with Elena. What does it feel like to lose the words?" She slipped the letter under the door. 3 days later, she found the answer. This time it was 2 paragraphs. The handwriting was still shaky, but it was legible. "It feels like dying," Professor Robert wrote. "Words were my life, my identity. Without them, I don't know who I am." And then, a question. "Why do you care?" Maria read those 4 words over and over. Why do you care? It was a simple question, but it contained all the pain of a man who had lost faith in humanity, a man who no longer understood why anyone would care about him. That night, Maria sat at her small kitchen table. She took out paper and pen, and she began to write the most important letter of her life. She didn't think about the words. She just let them flow, like a river that had been dammed for 20 years and was finally finding its course. She told him everything. She told him about her father. She told him about the guilt she had carried for 2 decades. She told him about the sleepless nights, wondering what would have happened if she had done something. She told him about the promise she had made to herself, never to stand by and do nothing again. And she told him why she cared. "Because you're not a patient to me," she wrote. "You're a person who loves words as much as I love them, a person who is suffering in silence while the world keeps turning. And I can't watch that without doing something. I can't, because once I did nothing, and my father died." Maria responded that same night, "Because I watched my sister lose her identity, and I did nothing. I'm not going to make the same mistake twice." And so it began. A daily correspondence, handwritten letters, slipped under the door, questions and answers, stories and confessions. Maria told him about her life, about her elderly mother who lived far away, in a small town in Oaxaca where there was no internet or good phone signal, about the letters she wrote to her every week, without fail, for the past 20 years, about how each letter was a sacred ritual, sitting at the kitchen table, taking paper and pen, and writing everything that had happened during the week. She told him about how her mother kept all the letters in a wooden box next to her bed, how she reread them when she felt alone, how she had once told her, "Your letters are my company, Wachis, when I read them. It's like you're here with me." And she told him about her sister, Rosario, about the palsy, about the boyfriend who left her, about the 20 years of solitude that followed. Professor Robert began to respond more at first, just a few lines, then entire paragraphs, then complete pages. He told her about Elena, about the day he met her in the library, when she was looking for a book of poetry and he recommended Neruda, about how she had smiled and said, "I've already read Neruda. Recommend something I don't know." And he, nervous as a teenager, had told her about an obscure Mexican poet that no one knew. And she had listened, fascinated. He told her about the 5 years of letters, about how he waited for the mail every day as if it were a Christmas present, about how each letter from Elena made him feel alive, present, loved. He told her about the day she died, about how he held her hand until the very last moment, about how he read her favorite poem while she closed her eyes forever. He told her about his students, about the magic moments in the classroom, about how he felt when a student understood a poem for the first time, about that sensation of seeing a light turn on in someone's eyes. And he told her about the palsy, about the day he woke up and didn't recognize his own face, about how he looked in the mirror and saw a monster, about how the facial exercises made him feel like a clown, like an invalid, like someone who was no longer himself. And Maria listened, read, responded, not as a housekeeper, as a friend. But what you're about to hear is what changed everything. Listen carefully. A month after they started writing to each other, Maria noticed something. She was cleaning the hallway near Professor Robert's room when she heard a sound, something she had never heard before, a voice. She went closer to the door. She put her ear against the wood. It was Professor Robert. He was reading aloud. I was reading one of Maria's letters, and although her voice sounded slurred, although the words came out a little crooked, he was reading. Maria stayed there, listening, her heart racing, because she understood something at that moment, something that no neurologist had seen. Professor Bob wasn't doing the facial exercises because they were humiliating, because they were mechanical, because they had no meaning. But reading aloud? That made sense. That was what he had done his whole life. That was who he was. And every time he read a letter, every time he moved his lips to form words, he was doing exactly what the doctors wanted. He was exercising the muscles in his face, but he didn't feel it as exercise. He felt it as life. That night, Maria wrote a different letter. "Dear Professor Bob," she began, "I have a strange request. The next letter I write you, could you read it aloud? It doesn't matter how it sounds. I just want you to read it as if you were reading it to me." She slipped the letter under the door. The next day she wrote another letter, but this time she included something special. A poem. It wasn't a famous poem. It was a poem that she had found in one of Professor Bob's books, one that had markings in the margins, as if he had read it many times. And at the end of the letter she wrote, "Read it aloud. For me. Please." She didn't know if it would work. She didn't know if he would agree. But 2 days later, something incredible happened. Maria was cleaning the living room when she heard the door to Professor Bob's room open. She turned around. There he was, standing in the doorway, with a letter in his hand. It was the first time he had left his room in months. His face was still crooked. His left eye was still half closed. But there was something different about him. He had something that looked almost like dignity. "You asked me to read aloud," he said. His voice sounded slurred, but the words were clear. "All right, but I want you to listen." And then, standing there in the hallway, with his crooked face and broken voice, Professor Bob began to read. He read the poem that Maria had sent him. He read it slowly, with difficulty, stumbling over some words. His voice sounded slurred, as if the words had to climb a mountain to come out of his mouth. But they came out. Each word was a victory. Each phrase was a triumph. Each verse was a step back to who he had been. Maria listened to him with her heart in her throat. She didn't interrupt him, she didn't correct him, she didn't say anything. She just listened. And when Professor Bob reached the last verse, something changed in his face. It wasn't a dramatic change. It wasn't a magical transformation. It was something small, subtle, almost imperceptible. But Maria saw it. She saw how the muscles in his cheek moved. She saw how the corner of his mouth curved upward. She saw how his eyes, which had been dead for 8 months, began to shine. Professor Bob was trying to smile. It was a crooked smile, an imperfect smile. Half of his face wasn't responding, but the other half was, and that half was enough. When he finished, he did something that he hadn't done in 8 months. He smiled. Really, it was a crooked smile, an imperfect smile. But it was a smile. Maria couldn't hold back the tears. "That was beautiful," she said. Professor Bob shook his head. "No, it sounded terrible. My voice isn't what it used to be." But Maria didn't agree. "Your voice is exactly what it should be," she said. "It's the voice of a man who is fighting to come back, and that's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Professor Bob looked at her for a long moment. Then, something changed in his eyes. "Do you have another letter for me?" Maria smiled. "Always." And from that day on, everything changed. At first it was slow. Professor Bob would come out of his room for a few minutes, read a letter, and go back to locking himself away. But each day, the minutes turned into more minutes, and the more minutes turned into hours. A week later, Professor Bob started sitting in the living room. He wasn't hiding in his room anymore. He sat on the couch where he used to read when Eleanor was alive, the same couch where he had read her his first poems. Maria brought him a letter every morning, and every morning Professor Bob read it aloud. At first he only read Maria's letters, but one day he asked for something different. "Bring me Eleanor's letters," he said. Maria felt a lump in her throat. Eleanor's letters had been stored in that dusty box for 15 years. Since she died, Professor Bob hadn't been able to open it. But now he wanted to open it. He wanted to read them. He wanted to hear his wife's voice one more time, even if it was through his own words. Maria brought him the box. She put it on the table in front of him. Professor Bob opened it with trembling hands. He took the first letter. He looked at it for a long moment, and he began to read. His voice broke several times. Tears ran down his cheeks, but he didn't stop. He read letter after letter, reliving the 5 years of long-distance love that had built their marriage. When he finished, he looked at Maria. "Thank you," he said, "for giving Eleanor back to me, for giving me back to myself." Maria just nodded. She didn't need words. The silence said it all. From that day on, Professor Bob began reading Eleanor's letters every day. One in the morning, one at night, like they were prayers, like they were medicine. And little by little, his voice began to improve. The physical therapist noticed it first. He came once a week to check on Professor Bob's progress, and each week, he was more surprised. "The muscles in his face are responding better," he told Edward. "Has he been doing the exercises?" Edward shook his head. "Not that I know of, he always refuses." The physical therapist frowned. "That's strange, because something is working. His facial muscles are more toned. His articulation has improved significantly." Edward didn't understand, but he decided to investigate, and that's how he discovered what Maria had been doing. They weren't traditional facial exercises. They were letters, readings aloud, poetry recited in an empty hallway. Every time Professor Bob read a letter, he was exercising the muscles in his face. Every time he pronounced a word, he was stimulating the damaged nerves. Every time he tried to smile at the end of a beautiful verse, he was training his brain to reconnect the neurological pathways. It was therapy, but disguised as love. His voice still sounded a little different. His words still came out slightly crooked, but each day, a little less, because without realizing it, he was doing exactly what the doctors wanted. He moved the muscles in his face. He stimulated the nerves. He worked the lips, the tongue, the cheeks. But he didn't feel it as therapy. He felt it as poetry. The physical therapist, who came once a week, couldn't believe it. "What's going on?" he asked Edward after a session. "Your father has improved more in the last month than in the previous 8 months combined. What changed?" Edward didn't know what to answer, because he didn't understand either, until that Saturday. What you're about to hear is the moment that changed everything. If you've connected with this story, hit that heart button. Edward decided to visit his father unannounced. He hadn't come in weeks because his business meetings had been consuming him. But something propelled him that day. A feeling of urgency he couldn't explain. He cancelled all his appointments, got into his car, and drove for an hour to his father's house. During the drive, he thought about everything that had happened in the last few months. He thought about the thousands of dollars he had spent on treatments. He thought about the specialists who had failed. He thought about his father, locked in that room, slowly dying of shame. And he thought about Maria, the housekeeper he had hired without a second thought. One more woman among so many who had passed through that house, a woman he had barely noticed. What was she doing that the doctors couldn't do? He arrived at the house at 3 in the afternoon. He went in quietly. He didn't want to interrupt his father if he was resting. And then he heard something that left him paralyzed. A voice, his father's voice, reading. He followed the sound to the living room, and what he saw made him fall to his knees. Professor Robert was sitting in an armchair. He had a letter in his hands, and he was reading it aloud. His voice still sounded different. His words still came out a little crooked, but he was reading, with emotion, with life, with the same fire that Edward remembered from when he was a kid and his father read him stories before bed. And there were tears on his face. But there was also a smile. Sitting across from him, listening attentively, was Maria, the housekeeper Edward had hired to clean. Edward stood at the doorway, unable to move. His father looked up. He saw him, and his smile grew bigger. "Son," he said, "come here. I want you to meet someone." Edward walked towards them as if he were in a dream. He sat on the sofa across from his father. "This is Maria," Professor Robert said. "She gave me back my words." Edward looked at Maria. He looked at her, really looked at her, maybe for the first time. He saw a woman of 44 with a blue apron and calloused hands, a woman who had no college degree or medical certifications, a woman he had hired to mop floors. And that woman had achieved what the best neurologists, physical therapists and psychologists had been unable to achieve. She had brought his father back to life. "How?" Edward asked. His voice cracked. "How did you do it?" Maria lowered her gaze. "It wasn't anything special. I just wrote him letters and asked him to read them aloud." Edward shook his head. "No, it had to be something more. I spent thousands of dollars on treatments. I hired the best specialists, and nothing worked." Maria looked at him directly. "Because the specialist saw a patient," she said. "I saw a man of letters, an English professor, a poet, a man who had lived for words and had lost them." She pointed to the letters on the table. He didn't need facial exercises. He needed to be who he was again. He needed to read. He needed to write. He needed to feel that the words still belonged to him. Edward looked at his father. Professor Robert nodded. "It's true the exercises felt humiliating, but reading poetry, that has never been humiliating. That's who I am." Edward felt tears streaming down his cheeks. For 8 months. He had tried to cure his father with money, with specialists, with treatments. But what his father needed couldn't be bought. It had to be written. That night, Edward didn't go back to his apartment. He stayed at his father's house, and for the first time in months, they had dinner together. It was a simple dinner. Maria had prepped the ingredients before leaving, but Professor Robert insisted on cooking it himself. His hands trembled as he chopped the vegetables. It took him twice as long as normal, but it didn't matter, because he was cooking. He was doing something normal, something he hadn't done in 8 months. Edward watched him from the kitchen doorway. He saw his father moving through the space, as if he were relearning how to inhabit it. He saw him touching the knives, the pots, the ingredients with a mixture of fear and determination, and he felt the tears running down his cheeks. For 8 months, he had watched his father disappear. He had watched the man who had raised him become a shadow. He had spent fortunes trying to bring him back, and now, thanks to a housekeeper who wrote letters, his father was cooking. It was a small miracle, but it was a miracle. Professor Robert cooked something simple, but he cooked it himself. And while he cooked, he talked. He told stories of his youth, stories of Elena, stories of his students. His voice still sounded different, but now that difference didn't seem like a disability. It seemed like a battle scar, a war wound, the proof that he had fought and had survived. After dinner, Maria showed them something. She had kept all the letters, hers and Professor Robert's, more than 200 letters in 4 months. Professor Robert looked at them with shining eyes. "It's a book," he said. "Without realizing it, we wrote a book." And then he had an idea. A week later, Professor Robert recorded his first video. He was sitting in his study with a camera in front of him. His face was still partially paralyzed. His speech still sounded slurred. But he began to read. He read a poem by Pablo Neruda, then one by Octavio Paz, then one of his own, one he had written during the years of letters with Elena. Edward uploaded the video to YouTube. They weren't expecting anything. It was just an experiment, a way for Professor Robert to share his love of literature with the world, even though he could no longer stand in front of a classroom. They chose a simple title: An English Professor with Bell's Palsy Reads Poetry. There was no professional production, no elaborate editing. It was just Professor Robert sitting in his study with a camera pointed at him, reading poems with his crooked voice. Edward uploaded it at 10 p.m. He thought maybe they'd get a few views. Maybe some of his father's former students would see it and leave a kind comment. He went to sleep without checking the stats. The next morning, when he woke up and opened his phone, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The video had 50,000 views, and it just kept climbing. Edward thought there must be a mistake. He checked again. No mistake. The video had gone viral, not because the reading was perfect. Quite the opposite. People could see the crooked smile. They could hear the slurred speech, but they could also see something more. They could see a man who refused to give up. A man who loved words so much that he spoke them, even when his body wouldn't cooperate. The comments started rolling in. "I'm crying," someone wrote. "My mother had a stroke and stopped speaking out of shame. I'm going to show her this video." Another wrote, "I'm a teacher and I had Bell's palsy 2 years ago. I stopped teaching, but you've given me courage. I'm going back to the classroom." And another, "Words are stronger than the body. Thank you for reminding me." Professor Robert Bob Salazar read every comment, and each one gave him more strength. He recorded another video, and another, and another. Each week, a new poem, a new reading. A new testament to the fact that the human voice is more than just vocal cords and facial muscles. The videos were imperfect. Professor Salazar's voice still sounded different. His face was still crooked. Sometimes he drooled. Sometimes he stumbled over a word. But that was exactly what made them so powerful, because people weren't seeing perfection. They were seeing humanity. They were seeing a man fighting against his own body to do what he loved. They were seeing courage, vulnerability, authenticity, and that resonated. Retired teachers wrote to him saying that his videos had given them the courage to return to teaching. Patients with Bell's palsy wrote, saying they no longer felt ashamed. Students from all over the world asked him for advice about poetry, about literature, about life. Professor Salazar responded to everyone, every message, every comment, every virtual letter, because he now understood that his mission wasn't over. It had just changed form. He no longer taught in a classroom. He taught to the entire world. 6 months later, his channel had 50,000 subscribers, and it kept growing. And Professor Salazar was teaching again, not in a traditional classroom. Now he taught online. He had students from all over the world, people who wanted to learn literature from a man who had lost half of his face and gained double the soul. His paralysis never completely disappeared. He still had a slightly crooked smile. He still drooled sometimes. He still had bad days. But he didn't care anymore, because he had understood something that the doctors couldn't teach him. He wasn't his face. He was his words. And the words remained intact. If this story moved something inside you, I invite you to do something, not for me, but for you. Think about that person who has lost their identity, and ask yourself what small gesture you could make to help them find it again. There's something else you need to know. One day, 3 months after Professor Salazar started his YouTube channel, he received a special message. It was from a woman named Maria. "Professor Salazar," she wrote, "I'm Maria, Lisa's sister. I'm 50 years old, 20 years ago. I had Bell's palsy, my boyfriend left me, and I never recovered. Not from the paralysis, from the rejection, from the shame. But yesterday I watched one of your videos, and I cried for an hour. Not because I felt sorry for myself, because it gave me hope. You have a crooked smile, and you keep reading poetry. You have slurred speech, and you keep teaching. You lost half of your face and gained double the courage. Thank you. Thank you for showing me that shame doesn't have to win. Professor Salazar read the message with tears in his eyes. For several minutes, he couldn't do anything. He just sat there, in front of the screen, reading those words over and over. Thank you for showing me that shame doesn't have to win. Those words hit him with a force he didn't expect, because he had felt exactly the same way. He had let shame win for 8 months, and if it hadn't been for Lisa, he would probably still be locked in his room, slowly dying. But now, thanks to some handwritten letters, he was alive. He was teaching. He was helping others find their voice, and Lisa's sister, a woman who had spent 20 years hiding, was finally finding hers. Words have power, but only when we use them. Professor Salazar got up from his desk. He walked through the house until he found Lisa. Your sister wrote to me, he said. Lisa nodded. I know, she called me last night, crying, but tears of joy. Professor Salazar looked at her for a long moment. Thank you, he said. Not just for the letters, not just for giving me back my words. Thank you for seeing in me what I couldn't see. Lisa smiled. That's what people who write letters do. We see what others can't see, and we put it into words. Professor Salazar nodded. And then he said something that Lisa would never forget. The words gave me back my face, but you gave me back my soul. And that is the truth sometimes, and the most powerful therapy doesn't come from a doctor. It doesn't come from a specialist. It doesn't come from someone with titles and certifications. It comes from someone who understands, someone who sees beyond the body, someone who touches the soul. Elisa wasn't a neurologist. She wasn't a physical therapist. She wasn't a psychologist. She was a woman who wrote letters, who had seen her sister destroyed by shame, who had vowed not to let it happen to anyone else, and she kept her vow, with paper, with ink, with handwritten words in a world of instant messages. Edward changed his life after that. He created a foundation in Lisa's name, the Words That Heal Foundation. It funds writing therapy for people with illnesses that affect speech and expression. They hired Lisa as the coordinator. She no longer cleans houses. Now she trains other people to do what she did, to connect with patients through letters, to give them back the identity that the illness stole. The foundation's first patient was a 42-year-old pianist who had suffered a stroke. He couldn't move his right hand. The doctors said he would never play again. But Lisa saw something in him. She saw that the piano wasn't just his job. It was his identity. It was who he was. So she wrote him letters about music. She asked him to explain in writing how to play a piece. She asked him to describe the sound of each note, the feeling of each chord. And the pianist began to write. And as he wrote, his fingers began to move, little by little, key by key. 6 months later, he gave his first post-stroke concert. He played with only one hand, but he played. That was the foundation's first success. But it wasn't the last. Now they have over 200 patients, people with aphasia, relearning to speak through letters, people with Parkinson's, finding stability in the act of writing, people with depression, discovering they still have something to say. And it all began with a housekeeper who decided to write a letter. Professor Bob Salazar is still teaching. His YouTube channel now has over 100,000 subscribers. He receives hundreds of messages each week from people who found hope in his slurred speech. And Maria is still writing letters. Every week. She writes to her mother. The old woman is already 84 years old, but she still awaits her Saturday letter, like a little girl waiting for Christmas presents. Every week, she writes to Professor Bob, even though they now see each other every day at the foundation, even though they talk on the phone constantly. The weekly letter is still sacred. It's their ritual, their way of keeping alive the connection that saved them both. And every week, she writes to her sister, Rose, the same Rose who spent 20 years hidden from the world, the same Rose who never recovered from her boyfriend's abandonment. But something has changed in Rose. After watching Professor Bob's videos, something inside her awoke. If a 58-year-old man with a paralyzed face could stand in front of a camera and read poetry. She could leave her house. Now. Rose volunteers at the foundation. She helps other patients with Bell's palsy. She tells them her story. She shows them that life doesn't end when your face changes. And for the first time in 20 years, Rose smiles. Not a perfect smile. There's still a little asymmetry in her face, but she smiles. Because she finally understood what Maria and Professor Bob taught her. We are not our faces, we are our souls. Because letters aren't just words on paper. They are bridges, they are connections, they are reminders that we are not alone. And in a world where everything is instant, where everything is digital, where everything is ephemeral, a handwritten letter is an act of love, an act of patience, an act of faith, an act that can save a life. This is the story of Professor Robert Bob Salazar, an English professor who lost his face, but not his essence. A man who taught for 30 years and thought he would never teach again. A man who was dying of shame, until a housekeeper reminded him that he was more than his face. This is the story of Maria, a woman who had no college degrees, no medical certifications, a woman who cleaned houses for a living, a woman who carried the guilt of not saving her sister, and decided she wouldn't make the same mistake twice. This is the story of words, of their power to destroy us when we lack them, of their power to heal us when we find them again, of how a handwritten letter can do what thousands of dollars in treatments cannot. And this is the story of all of us, because we all have something that defines us, something that we are, beyond our bodies, something that no disease can take away, if we find a way to express it. And if you're listening to this, I want you to ask yourself a question. Is there someone in your life who has lost their identity? Is there someone who is hiding from the world? Is there someone who needs to be reminded who they were? You don't need to be a doctor. You don't need to be a therapist. You don't need to have all the answers. You just need to see that person, really see them, and tell them, with words or with actions, that their identity doesn't depend on their body, that they are more than their illness, more than their appearance, more than what the mirror reflects, because we are all more than what meets the eye. And sometimes, all we need is someone to remind us. Think about it, and then act. You don't have to write a letter. It can be a call. It can be a visit. It can be simply sitting next to someone and listening. The important thing is not the method. The important thing is the intention. The intention of seeing someone, really seeing them, not their illness, not their disability, not what they have lost, but who they are and who they were and who they can be, and again, because we all deserve to be seen, and we all have the power to see someone else, somewhere, right now. There's a soul waiting for someone to see it. There's a professor who stopped teaching because he believes his voice is no longer worthwhile. And there's an artist who stopped painting because her hands no longer work as they used to. There's a mother who stopped smiling because she no longer recognizes her own face. There are thousands of people hiding from the world because illness stole something they thought was essential. But illness lies, because what is essential is never lost. It only hides, and sometimes it just needs someone to look for it. That someone could be you. Thank you for listening to this story until the end. I know it was long. I know I asked for many minutes of your life, but if you made it this far, it's because something in this story touched you. Maybe it reminded you of someone you know, a father, a mother, a sibling, a friend, someone who is struggling against something that stole part of their identity. Maybe it reminded you of yourself. Maybe you too are hiding something. Maybe you too feel that you lost a part of who you were. Or maybe you were simply moved to see that people like Maria still exist. People who work in silence, without expecting recognition, without asking for anything in return. People who see what others cannot see and act when others remain paralyzed, whatever the reason. I want you to know something. This story is real, not in the specific details, but in its essence. There are thousands of Marias in the world. There are thousands of Professor Bobs. There are thousands of stories of healing that are never told because they happen in silence, between people. The world doesn't notice. And there's a story waiting to be written. A story where you are the protagonist. A story where you are the person who sees, who acts, who heals. Leave me a comment. Tell me about that person who needs someone to give them back their words. Tell me about that father who stopped talking, that mother who stopped smiling, that sibling who stopped going out, that friend who hid from the world. Tell me, because every story matters, every person matters, and every word of encouragement can be the beginning of a miracle. And if you know someone who is struggling with their identity, share this video with them. Sometimes, the stories we hear give us the courage to do what we must do. This was the story of Maria Torres, a woman who cleaned houses, who wrote letters to her mother every week, who carried the guilt of not saving her father for 20 years, a woman who saw a professor dying of shame and decided that she wasn't going to stand by and do nothing. A woman without degrees, without certifications, just paper, a pen, and a heart that understood pain. And with that, she saved a life the best doctors couldn't save, a life the most expensive treatments couldn't restore, a life everyone had given up on. But Maria didn't give up, and words won. Words heal. Don't forget that. Never forget that. And the next time you see someone hiding from the world, remember this story. Remember that behind every paralyzed face, there's a poet waiting to speak. Remember that behind every slurred speech, there's a melody waiting to be sung. Remember that behind every person who has lost hope, there's a human being waiting to be seen. And remember, you have the power to see them. One letter at a time, one word at a time, one glance at a time. It doesn't matter if your handwriting is messy. It doesn't matter if you don't know what to say. It doesn't matter if you think your words aren't enough. What matters is that you write, that you speak, that you connect. Because somewhere, there's someone waiting to hear you, and your words might be exactly what they need. Words heal. Never forget that.